I'm Samantha Burton, and I'm here to talk to you about Helen McNicoll. What makes Helen McNicoll's work Canadian? How does her work contribute to the canon of Canadian art? These are tough questions to ask about an artist who lived and worked in the decades between Confederation and World War I, a time when what it meant to be Canadian was in tremendous flux. Helen McNicoll is one of Canada's most significant women artists. She was born in Toronto in 1879 and raised in Montreal. Does this alone make her work Canadian? McNicoll began her artistic education at the Art Association of Montreal. You can see an example of her early work on the left here. She would later have a prolific and prize-winning exhibiting record at the AAM, as well as at the Ontario Society of Artists and the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. September Evening, on the right, was awarded the AAM's prestigious Jessie Dow Prize in 1908. Does her participation in this native artistic network make her work Canadian? Well, yes and no. McNicoll left Canada for London, England in her early 20s, never to return to Canada permanently. The artist was a member of the first, and really the only, generation of Canadian artists to study and exhibit abroad. She trained at the Slade School of Art and exhibited at some of the most prominent British venues of the day. She also traveled widely, working in rural artist colonies across Britain and the continent to produce works like these. McNicoll very rarely painted Canadian subjects, and furthermore, worked in a style, Impressionism, that was identified by contemporary audiences as decidedly un-Canadian. So what then does make an artist like McNicoll Canadian? Let's look further at the artist's life and work before attempting to answer this question. Helen Galloway McNicoll was born to a wealthy and socially connected family. She experienced hearing loss after a bout of scarlet fever when she was just 2. Although never mentioned in contemporary reviews of her work, McNicoll's deafness must have influenced her career on many levels. In particular, I think we might look to the sense of quiet detachment that characterizes many of her paintings. In works such as On the Cliffs, the figures are silently absorbed in their inner worlds. They do not acknowledge each other, nor the viewer. Other senses, though, are evoked through McNicoll's use of Impressionist style. In Sunny September, for example, the viewer imagines the warmth of the sun, the smell of the ocean, and the rustle of the grasses. The artist became well known in her own time for these studies of sunshine, painted outdoors. This emphasis on sense perception was characteristic of Impressionism, a movement that originated in Paris in the 1870s, when a group of young artists, including Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, and Pierre-Auguste Renoir, came together to experiment with new approaches to perspective, light, and brushwork. Painting more than 30 years after Impressionism's French heyday, McNicoll would adopt all of these strategies in her own work. A number of her images show a particular affinity with Monet, as you might be able to see here in these examples, and again here in her landscape work. Another characteristic of Impressionism was an interest in modern subject matter. Female artists like McNicoll often turn their attention to scenes from bourgeois domestic life. In images like these, she reveals the separate world of middle-class women and children. In other images, though, she represented rural figures, laboring bodies, showing that the experience of modern femininity and childhood was hardly universal. McNicoll also tackled the subject of modern professional women. Represented in the chintz sofa is her lifelong partner, the British artist Dorothea Sharp. McNicoll represents Sharp sewing not in a domestic space, but actually in their shared London studio, a site of work. Under the shadow of the tent, too, shows two women in the act of collaborative artistic production. And you can see one of them here is looking at a sketchbook, while the other holds a portable paint box. McNicoll, alongside colleagues such as James Wilson Maurice and Maurice Cullen, played an important role in popularizing Impressionism in Canada in the 1890s and 1900s, the artists bringing the lessons they learned abroad home to the walls of Montreal galleries. These artists frequently faced antagonism from the public, who viewed Impressionism as both too modern and too French. Although McNicoll's own reviews were really quite positive, the Montreal Gazette described the movement as characterized by extreme effects and extravagant technique. This brief flourishing of Impressionism in Canada was ended by World War I. After the war, a new generation emerged, foremost among them the Group of Seven, whose landscapes, as you're seeing here, were hailed as evidence of a homegrown Canadian modernism. The group's rejection of European training and tradition became the foundation of a still strong nationalist narrative of Canadian art history. The true Canadian artist, critic Fred Hauser wrote in 1926, is a new type of artist, one who puts on the outfit of the bushwhacker and prospector, who paddles, portages, and makes camp, who sleeps in the out-of-doors under the stars, who climbs mountains with his sketchbox on his back. Too modern before the war and not Canadian enough after, expatriate artists like McNicoll have largely failed to secure a place within this narrative. The long neglect of historical women artists in Canadian art history has also played a big role in the lack of attention given to her work through much of the 20th century. In 1915, McNicoll's career was suddenly cut short when she died at the age of 35. By then, she had amassed an impressive exhibition record and been elected an associate of both the Royal Canadian Academy and the Royal Society of British Artists. Reviews of the 1915 exhibition season mentioned her death. Saturday Night stated that none who saw her recent work can doubt that had she been spared, she would have added materially to her own laurels and to the reputation abroad of Canadian art. This is an acknowledgement of an artist who, by sending her canvases back and forth across the Atlantic, acted as a valuable cultural link between Canada and Europe. So, in the end, what is Canadian about an artist who lived abroad and worked in a style explicitly identified as foreign? If we go by Fred Hauser's definition, maybe not much. However, as today's art world becomes increasingly globalized, Helen McNicoll's career provides an important model for understanding Canada's place within both historical and contemporary transnational artistic networks. Her work asks us to think about how we might define national identity and national art histories beyond strict geographical borders. What counts as Canadian art? Who decides? By what criteria? Helen McNicoll's life and work raises these questions and ultimately presents us with the exciting opportunity not simply to add another artist to the existing narrative of Canadian art, but rather to expand the parameters of what we think of as Canadian art and what we think it means to be Canadian. Thank you.